My name is Maren Jimenez, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest installment in the Division for Inclusive Social Development's webinar series, Spotlight on Insecurity, Inequality, and Poverty. We began this webinar series 4 years ago during the height of the COVID pandemic as a way to inform DESA's analytical work on social issues for inclusion in our report, our flagship publication, the World Social Report. And we've continued it because we found it really useful and engaging and a great way to reach out to some great minds that we have. And it has really contributed to success, including our speaker today. It's a great pleasure to have with us Francisco Fejeda. He's been a collaborator in the past on the World Social Report, and he's currently the Amartya Sen Professor of Inequality Studies at the London School of Economics, where he's also the director of the International Inequalities Institute. Chico's presentation titled today is there a new consensus on inequality? And this is a question that is highly relevant to the work we're doing right now on the World Social Report. From our end, as we approach the 30th anniversary of the World Summit for Social Development, our team is examining how our thinking around the core areas that were discussed at that summit in terms of poverty and inequality, employment, and social inclusion has changed since 1995. Thank you again, Chico, for joining us today. Before I hand over the floor to you, just a housekeeping message. You'll give your presentation about 30 or 40 minutes. Then we'll open the floor for questions. We ask participants to please enter their questions in the Q&A box in Zoom, and then we'll take as many questions as you allow us to ask you. Thanks again, Chico.
Thank you, Maren, and thank you to Marta as well for the invitation. Great to be able to talk to you a little bit in as you prepare your World Social Report, which is an important publication that I like a lot. So let me share here. Let me share here my screen and let's see. Can you guys see that? Okay.
Yep, looks great.
Great. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is this question: is there a new consensus on inequality? As Maren said, and it may seem like a funny question to ask, right? It's not the kind of paper I normally like. So I normally write. So just to give you a little bit of background about how this came into being, there's a group at LSE, at the London School of Economics, headed by Tim Besley and Andres Velasco, who convened a bunch of people on a project that they called "Is There a London Consensus?" And I think the London part of it was a little bit of gimmick because of LSE, but the question they were asking was, we've all heard about the Washington Consensus from the 1990s and the time of structural adjustment and so on. The world's changed a great deal since then. Is there a new policy consensus, was what they were asking. And there were a number of us, maybe 20 or so, who were asked to write papers, and I was asked to write one about inequality. So this is why there is this topic sort of vaguely trying to take stock a little bit of inequality and where there is agreement and where there is disagreement today. I think most of us actually involved in that project didn't really like the word consensus very much. But the question, the way I'm asking is there, where is there broad agreement and where is there less agreement in issues around inequality? So I start by noting that the profile of the topic has certainly increased a great deal since the days of the Washington Consensus. So the paper in 1989 that John Williamson wrote, where he introduced what he thought was the Washington Consensus, and it's important to note that he wasn't necessarily proposing those policies. He was writing down what he thought were the sort of consensus policies in the US administration and the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on at the time. So if you search that document for the word inequality, you don't find it. There was 0 of 5,806 words in the paper. Whereas in this new initiative that Tim and Andres were putting together, there's a whole chapter dedicated to it. And this has been a gradual process, which I've written about elsewhere in terms of how inequality has grown in profile and importance, both within the economics profession and more generally socially, and also in the international financial institutions. I think the UN is somewhat different. It was always more of a the UN was always more open to and concerned with issues of inequality than the World Bank and the IMF. But I think even in the UN, there's been an increase. Um, Now, as I was saying, a lot of what they're interested in is policy consensus. Inequality is not a policy area. It can be addressed through all different kinds of policies. It's a characteristic of the economy and society. So the short paper on which this presentation is based, which is available as a working paper in the International Inequalities Institute at LSE, I discuss as I was saying, where there is and there isn't a broad agreement in three main areas, on the nature, levels, and changes of inequality, on the consequences of inequality, and on policy responses. And of course, even this is a dramatic summary, and I had to be pretty selective, and the selections are somewhat idiosyncratic. Other people might have chosen different things to focus on, but these were my choices. So with nature, level, and changes, so basically the facts, if you like, around inequality, I'm going to highlight 3 areas of broad agreement, and then 2 areas where I think there's less agreement, and I'll spend a fair amount of time on those, actually. So the first area where there's broad agreement is that people in general now think income and wealth inequality in the world are widespread and generally high, too high. This is just a little picture here for countries in 2020. The gray bars are the income shares of the top 10%, so ranging from just over 20% of total income to more than 40%. And these are the in black here, in dark black, are the shares of the bottom 10%. And these numbers, which you probably can hardly see, are the ratios of the share of the top 10% to the bottom 20%. And they range, as you can see, from almost 5 in the most income equal countries in the world, to 20, 30, even 46 in the case of Colombia in this particular data here. So, the levels of inequality are very high, and I think very few people now dispute that the levels of inequality are high, although what those levels are exactly is something else that I'm going to come to in a moment. But there is agreement that they're high, almost everywhere. There's also agreement, I think, that there isn't just a single kind of inequality, but that there are multiple inequalities, and furthermore, that they are associated. So this was income inequality, which we often think about, but there are inequalities in wealth, in education, in health status, in political power and the degree of participation in society, in individual agency, in recognition by institutions and by other people, in opportunities, right? The picture just displays an example from health. What we got here is infant mortality by wealth quintile in a number of Latin American countries. This is from a paper that I'm not an author of. It's a paper by Antonella Bancalari and others for the Latin American and Caribbean Inequality Review project that I am associated with. And for that, they computed the infant mortality rates per thousand for wealth quintiles of households. So this is, for example, the lowest quintile has the highest typically the highest mortality rate, and then the second and the third, the fourth and the fifth. It's not always exactly monotonic like this, but you see these big dispersions, right? So and this red line here is the benchmark, which is the average for 37 OECD countries. So in the OECD, infant mortality is of the order of 4 to 5 per thousand. In Latin America, in these particular countries in Latin America, the number is much higher. The average is around 26 or 27 per thousand. But you can see that those are distributed quite unequally within countries. Here's Paraguay, here's Bolivia, Guyana. And not only is there inequality on that margin of infant mortality, but that inequality is correlated with income, right? So there's this association of inequalities in which having less income is associated with having a higher infant mortality and less education and less political power and so on in many cases. So there's this different dimensions of inequality, but also the association between them. It's not perfect. You can see some cases here where it's not the lowest decile that has the least or the highest income mortality, but on the whole, there's definitely a strong correlation there. So inequalities are high and they're multiple and they are associated. And then the third area of agreement is that these summary inequality statistics, whether in income or in health, are not the only thing that matters, and they miss an important component of inequality that people are very interested in, which are group-based or horizontal inequalities, and that these horizontal inequalities matter at least as much as vertical inequalities or just inequalities in the simple distribution. And what we mean by group-based inequalities are gaps by gender or by race or by ethnicity or by caste and religion, right? So for example, in this graph here, that's just an example from an old paper I did with Jeremy Gignoux, where we have enrollment by age for boys and girls in Turkey. So this is Turkey. And up here, you've got the school enrollment rates, 80%, 60%, whatever they are, by child age, for girls separated into groups by the education of the mother. So this is girls with mothers with no education, primary education only, or secondary or higher. And the same thing down here for boys. And the patterns may look similar, but if you look carefully, for example, at age 16, which is an important age because it's around the transition to secondary school, and you compare, for example, boys from more educated parents or mothers in this case, 90% of them are still enrolled as they begin the age for secondary schooling. But only, fewer than 30% of girls from mothers with no education are enrolled. So these are the kinds of gaps that, I'm sure all of you are familiar with. I mean, you might have known the specific numbers in Turkey or not, but there are these very big gaps across groups, again, racially, ethnically, in terms of caste, and so on. And these are salient and they matter. They matter socially, they matter politically. And I think that, again, is an area of broad agreement, okay? So let me move now to an area where, surprisingly, there is some disagreement, and that is the exact levels of income inequality. So I said that, there's a lot of agreement that they are high, but that's kind of a fuzzy agreement that they're high. If you ask yourself, or if you ask your students or your RAs to go and find out what inequality is specifically in Peru, for example, okay, they might go to the World Income Inequality Database that's run out of WIDER, part of the UN family, right? The United Nations University in Helsinki. And there you'll find a number of statistics, including the shares of top 1%, okay? And if you look at Peru there, you'll find that it is 8%. Yeah? According to the WID database, the income share of the top 1% in Peru is 8%. Or they might have gone to the WID in Paris, the World Inequality Database, which even the name is very similar. There they would find that the income share of the top 1% is 28%. Sorry, or 26%, whatever this is. Okay. And this is not unique for Peru. Peru is particularly striking, but it's general across a number of countries. This presentation was something I was talking about people in Latin America, so the Latin American countries are highlighted, but it's true for lots of other countries as well. And they are systematically higher in the WID, and this, as you will probably have guessed, has to do with the use of tax data and national accounts statistics in the WID in Paris, which are not used here. So we have another paper, which I'll use some slides from in a moment, where we try to document the sources of these disparities, going beyond these two sources. But the main one, to cut to the chase, is different data sources, and in particular, the usage of household surveys versus tax records and the intent to incorporate aggregate totals from the national accounts and distribute them across the distribution. Okay, but I mean, you can see that here is quite a striking thing. These are very well-known databases, and people use them all the time. And depending on which website they happen to go to, they'll get very different answers to this question of what inequality is. And it would be similar if you had the Gini coefficient or something else here, okay? In fact, in this other paper that I talked about with Alvaredo, Bourguignon, and Lustig, we look specifically at Latin America, and we look at a much wider range of sources, although we do use the WID, the Helsinki WID, the UNU wider WID as our base. But here, and we find thousands of estimates of Gini coefficients for Latin America in that period. And here I'm plotting the series for Brazil. And the striking thing about the Brazilian series is that for a particular year, be it 1960 or be it 2020, you get a range of estimates, right? A range of different estimates of inequality. Perhaps that was not so surprising here in the census of 1960 or 1970. But in the middle, there's a little bit less variation when primarily the only source of data was household surveys. But back here, that's back because these numbers up here will be the ones typically trying to impute income from national accounts. The sources of this variation are threefold. Different data sources are the main ones, as I've said. But there's also the fact that people use different income concepts or different definitions of the distribution. Some distributions are by individual, some are by household, some are just by adults. Some people use earnings, some people use household income, some people use consumption. And household income can be per capita or can be equivalized, and all of these things matter. And then in addition, even if you had the same concept and the same data sort, people do different things to the distribution, right? Some analysts will trim the top and the bottom 1%, others won't. Some will impute rent for owner-occupiers, others won't. Some will correct for missing informations, others won't. So there is a wide range of variation and uncertainty in this, okay? Indeed, we try to document here for 10 countries, how much of it was due to differences amongst household survey data only, which is this band 2, an average of 1.7 Gini points across these countries. In blue, we've got this band 3, which brings in data just from household surveys, but also data of household surveys combined with tax data. And in yellow, finally, when you also try to incorporate income from the national accounts, as they do, particularly the Piketty group does in Paris, and their co-authors and colleagues and students and so on. So, there are large level differences introduced by incorporating different sources of data, household surveys, but then tax, distributing income from national accounts, and so on. Now, is that these numbers, these large gaps, these wide ranges, we call them in this paper inequality bands, because there are these kind of bands of inequality moving around rather than a specific level. Are these a problem? I mean, perhaps all of these things that are done are improvements, and we are simply here, and this was simply wrong, and now we have a right one. And I think a number of people act that way, whether they've thought through it or not. That seems to be the assumption. The problem is that, unfortunately, there's actually substantial data and methodological challenges in incorporating tax data and national accounts data to the surveys. So, this is a long discussion here. There's a short discussion here, but a longer discussion in the paper. The bottom line of it is it's not a trivial exercise. Household surveys are bad at capturing incomes at the top, for sure. They underestimate incomes at the top and capital incomes in particular. And therefore, they tend to underestimate inequality. We've learned that much is clear. But tax data in developing countries in general, will by definition miss the informal sector, which in Latin America, for example, can range from 40 to 60% of the labor force, as you know. And even some people in the formal sector don't have to even declare taxes, so they won't be in the tax data. So the tax data misses the bottom. So, the people working with these data are not stupid. They're very smart. They understood this. And so they try to combine data from tax and household surveys. One well-known example of doing this is by Thomas Blanchet, Inácio Flores, and Mark Morgan, where they use a nice method to try and combine these two. However, it turns out, and I was the PhD examiner for Mark, so I read the paper very carefully. And I knew that there were, some important assumptions or arbitrary choices that must be made. But more systematically, Emmanuel Flacher, Nora Lustig, and Andrea Vigorito have tried to examine different correction methods. And they find some real problems. They find that, the true threshold at which you merge the two data sets, income, the household survey and the tax, is unknown. And worse than that, if it was unknown, but estimates didn't make a big difference, that would be okay. But it's unknown and estimates do make a big difference. That is to say, the choice of these meeting points, the estimate of inequality is not robust to those, okay? So inequality measures may be significantly biased as a result. So the implication is that we now know that household surveys underestimate inequality. We know that inequality that we had estimated in these black bars, even there was some variation, but those are underestimates. Almost certainly they're underestimates, okay? But we don't know the true levels. We don't know that these ends here are the true levels. And certainly we don't know that about imputing income from the national accounts, where there are huge assumptions being made, okay? So we are in a world where there has been progress, but that progress has led to uncertainty. So we learned that the household surveys were inadequate in a way, but we don't know the full truth yet. So we now have ranges or bands of inequality. I say here, at least in less developed countries, but some of you may be familiar with the debate going on between Piketty, Size, and Zuckman on the one side and Otter and Splinter in the other, where they are arguing about the same kinds of adjustments done to the US data. This is published in the QJE. This is coming up in the JPE. So this is, presumably they've been well refereed, and there's huge disagreements in there. So I wanted to bring that out very clearly, so that we are aware that we are in a moment where our knowledge of exact inequality levels is fuzzy. Okay. A second area of disagreement is that the trend. So here there's less disagreement amongst scholars, but there is I would call it a dissonance between the public perception and the reality. I think the public perception often is in the streets, oh, inequality is rising everywhere. Of course, if you look at a number of countries for which we have the data, this is from work using only household surveys in this case that I did with Christoph Lachner and Annie Silwal when I was still at the World Bank, which we never published. But you do have inequality increasing in the vast majority of industrialized countries and in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So, in the north of the world, there's definitely a predominance of countries with inequality rising. But in Latin America and the Caribbean, over the same period, most countries had falling inequality. And in Africa, there is what Andrea Corner calls a bifurcation, right? Countries going in different ways. The average Gini in 1990 and 2015 for these 62 countries for which we had data is unchanged, okay? And in 32 countries, inequality was rising by more than 1 percentage point, but in 23, it was falling, okay? And at the time, if you looked at the data from the WID in Paris, for the countries where there were estimates in both, there wasn't that much disagreement on the trends, although there was a very substantial difference in coverage between the two. Now that would be different because the WID in Paris has expanded its coverage a lot, so I don't know what it would look like today. But the point is, the perception that relative inequality as such is rising everywhere is misguided. Certainly it's rising in many places, but it's also been falling in others. We can return to that if you like. So let me speed up a little bit, as I think I have at most 10 minutes, and I want to say a word about consequences of inequality and then a word about policies. So on consequences, I think there are three areas of broad agreement. One is that inequality matters intrinsically to well-being. And this comes from surveys on subjective well-being. It also comes from experimental evidence that many of you may be familiar with. The classic example are the papers on ultimatum games and dictator games, where people, the giver of the ultimatum is given, say, $100. He makes an offer to the other player, and the other player can accept or reject it, right? And the standard theory of self-regarding preferences of the selfish homo economics or economicus in economics would predict the Nash equilibrium of the game is you offer 1 to the other person, you keep 99. If the person rejects, nobody gets anything, you get 0. 1 is greater than 0, so the person should accept an offer of 1 and you should make an offer of 1. And what happens in reality is not that. A lot of people make offers between 30 and a half, or even in some cases more than a half. And a lot of people reject offers below 30 or below a half, and therefore giving up real money, because this is an experiment where you take home the money. So these kinds of evidence have suggested to people that human beings care about fairness in complicated ways. It's not always equality per se. There's other work that suggests people are more averse to inequalities that are beyond people's control, like inequality of opportunity, I often say. This Capella et al. Paper here is about that. But in any case, there's a lot of evidence out there that as human beings, people care intrinsically. Our own well-being is affected by inequality. Higher levels of inequality make us like society less and be less happy about where we live. There's also, I think, quite a lot of agreement now that substantial levels of inequality, when capital markets are imperfect, lead to inefficiency. And there's a lot of theory around that from, as far back as 1969. There's also empirical evidence. But the basic suggestion here is, if capital markets are not perfect, lots of people who have worthwhile projects, such as investing on their children, for example, but don't have access to their own wealth and cannot borrow for it, will not invest in these high return investments. Okay. So the classic example is wasted human capital investment, where people don't complete school and don't go on to college, even though they could be great engineers or scientists or what have you in the future, because, they're from poor households and they're taken out of school to help work or whatever, when it would have been efficient to invest in, right? Then there's a third reason why inequality matters, and that is I think there's now again widespread agreement. I cite some early papers here, but a lot has been written on this in the last 20 years, and I'm sure you are familiar with a lot of that. And I think, as I say, there is agreement that countries with large wealth inequality tend to also have political inequalities. They lead this, the billionaires and so on lead to elite capture, and institutions get captured. You can think of judges in the US Supreme Court being in the pockets of their rich donors and friends, and accepting all kinds of gifts from them. And that's the US, and it certainly happens in lots of other countries. In many poor countries, it happens a lot. So I think now, it's not, I'm not saying there's a consensus on this, but I think it's certainly the profession, the economics profession has moved in the 1980s from a position where you would have thought inequality didn't matter very much at all, to wide and broad recognition that it matters both intrinsically to well-being and instrumentally in terms of efficiency, both through a capital market and imperfect investment allocation channel, and through a political capture channel. Okay, so those three things are important. So what about policies then? Here again, I'm going to talk about three areas. Let me just remind myself. Yeah, an area of a lot of agreement, an area of some agreement, and an area where I think there's too little thought and research. So the area of broad agreement is what Jim Hackman and others refer to as redistribution, right? The idea that because inequality leads to inefficiency through underinvestment, particularly underinvestment in people, it makes sense to redistribute to children, basically, to invest in the young, in education, in early childhood development, in their health, so that they will become more productive members of society and therefore better off themselves. Okay, so this is the idea of pre-distribution. The example here is from an early childhood development intervention, a famous one in Jamaica that you may be familiar with, by Sally Grant and McGregor and others. And I'll briefly just walk you through these graphs. So what they did is they took a group of children, in particular a group of stunted children, okay, who were this group here, and a group of comparison children who had normal height at the beginning. And then they divided these into four groups, the stunted children into four groups: a control group that got nothing, a group that got milk, basically a nutritional supplement, a group that got stimulation through visits by social care workers that helped the parents play with the children and taught certain stimulation techniques and so on, and a group that got both, okay? And they follow these kids, which are of slightly different ages, but they follow them over 2 years. And what you see is that whereas the gap between the comparison group of children of normal height and the control group stayed the same or even grew, whereas these treatment groups closed that gap in development quotient. This is a sort of composite index of development quotient. I don't remember exactly what's in it, but it measures the child's development. And you see these guys basically catch up, okay? Interestingly, 20 years later, okay, Paul Gertler and collaborators in 2013 went back to Jamaica and found these guys, maybe not all of them, but enough of them, and looked at the wage distributions for them. And here you've got the control group. So these guys have this wage distribution. And this treatment group over here, the top treatment group, has this black distribution. You can reject the hypothesis they're the same. They're clearly different. In fact, lifetime earnings for these guys were almost 50% higher than for these guys. Okay. Now, this treatment group is here again, but now it's compared with this other group, and this other group is the comparison group, the children of normal height. And those two are indistinguishable statistically. Okay, so basically what we saw here in terms of the development quotient, we still saw in their earnings 20 years later. And this kind of evidence is used to suggest that these interventions are particularly efficient, have a lot of high return and so on. Now, I use one example. There are many, many others, and it's not all about early childhood interventions, which typically take place when children are in the 0 to 5 years of age range. There's also, of course, important investments that go on in primary school, secondary school, on health and other areas throughout the youth. But the core area here is about this idea of investing in the young and redistribution. There's somewhat less agreement about redistribution more generally, just the standard welfare state idea that you tax people and redistribute through benefits and transfers to those who are less well off. But there is growing agreement that the progressivity of tax rates has fallen over time, particularly since 1980 to today. What you've got here, and I'm not sure you can see this very well. This is actually from a New York Times animated thing where this line shifted around. I just took a picture of it some time ago. It's based on this book by Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman that you may know, called The Triumph of Injustice. And here what you've got is you've got the percentiles of income up to the 99th. Okay. But then this is the top 1% zoomed in this area here. Here's 99.99, and here's the top 400 people and so on. This particular one is in the US. And if you can see the shadows, right, here's the progressivity of taxation in 1950. And then, 1960 and so on. So if you had the moving thing, it goes down until in 2018. These guys are actually paying less tax than these guys. And basically, there's a flat total tax rate. Okay, so the obviously they pay more in dollars, but as a rate, as a share of their income, they pay the same as people down here in the very bottom of the U.S. distribution. So this is the injustice that Saez and Zucman are talking about, and the progressivity of income taxes has fallen, perhaps not as dramatically in other countries, but it has also fallen in other countries, and I think there is, again, not complete agreement, but now probably a majority view that there is more room for progressive taxes in many, many countries. Okay. Now, my last area, and this is an area where I would say there is perhaps not disagreement, but at least limited evidence and limited thought. And I'd like to end with this area because I think it's an important one. Is that the sort of magnitude of our interventions, either through predistribution or redistribution, are insufficient to deal with this dramatic fact, which I'm calling here the family curse, which is the fact that families are excellent at transmitting advantage or disadvantage, depending on what they are in, to the next generation. And we all know this. Here's a version from some work that we've done on inequality and inequality of opportunity, but it's basically a version of the Great Gatsby curve that many of you may be familiar with from Miles Korak and others. In the original Great Gatsby curve, they have intergenerational mobility here, or immobility, the persistence on this axis. And inequality of opportunity is very much like that persistence. You can think of it as the share of inequality in today's generation that is inherited from the past. And what you see is this positive association, which means the countries with more income inequality today also have the greatest persistence, that is the lowest mobility, the lowest ability for the poor to move up and the rich to move down. And of course, here are Latin American countries and South Africa and Rwanda and so on. The US is up here. Norway, Iceland, Finland, so on are down here. And this sort of transmission of opportunity and advantage over generations happens through many, many channels, transmission of genes, maybe, certainly transmissions of human capital, both through what happens at home and through school sorting and through teachers and peers in different schools, to transmissions of norms and beliefs in the house, through neighborhood effects, depending on where people live. There's even evidence that of transmission of employers across generations, and certainly of professional networks. And all of that is before getting to physical and financial wealth, which is here under bequests and inheritance. So, we as families are extremely good at transmitting what we have. Everyone is trying to do the best for their children. But if you have a lot more resources, be them educational or financial, you are able to do that to a better extent than poorer households, right? So what we need, in my view, is some more dramatic kind of intervention to address this because of this huge persistence force of inequality in the world. And in this last slide I just have a little example here from a kind of policy called the ultra poor policy, or the graduation programs. This particular example is in Bangladesh, but they have been done in other places. These policies transfer not only cash, but they transfer some assets, typically some livestock. In this case, I think it was a cow. Okay. So assets, some income, so you don't eat the cow, some training, so you know how to milk the cow, sometimes even some kind of insurance. So these are complex interventions. In this case, it's to very, very poor people, the poorest people in rural Bangladesh. And these policies, because they are complex, they not only have an impact at the end of the program, but the impact persists 3 years after treatment. And the reason they persist, these authors argue, is that they were able to actually induce an element of structural change, of occupational change. These were largely landless women in Bangladesh who worked primarily as domestic workers for other people in the village. And they move into some basic livestock management, by having this cow and maybe then another cow or some chickens or what have you, so that the improvement lasts beyond the end of the program time, which you don't see so often for lots of other programs. This is experimental evidence. It's very solid evidence. This particular program is for very few extremely poor people in Bangladesh. I think we need to think of examples like this, of programs that often will have to be complex, but that are able to make the equilibrium shift of moving people from the very bottom up towards a greater opportunity. And I don't think we have spent as much time in thinking about that beyond these extremely poor places. What would be the equivalent of this in Sao Paulo or Buenos Aires or Bangkok or New York City, for that matter? And I think we all can think of examples, but there hasn't been an enormous amount thought through that yet, and I'd like to see more. So let me stop there. I've stopped sharing. Thanks, Maren.
Thank you so much, Chico, for the presentation. It's really interesting. We've put a link to the paper in the chat. I encourage all the participants to take a look at the paper as well. We cover these issues, go into a little bit more depth. I mean, some of the points that definitely resonated with me in terms of our work here is just about this point that different indicators of inequality paint different pictures of its levels and trends at the global and the national level. So it's really difficult for us then, as a global institution to make sweeping statements about the level and then even possibly the direction of inequality. But we do see that there's rising concern over it, even if we're not exactly sure where inequality is falling these days. And that's because we know that the negative impacts on economic growth, on poverty reduction, and on, importantly, social mobility are proven. I think it's also important now that, we can think of equality of opportunity basically as a universally shared human aspiration for societies. So there's broad agreement now that investment in the health and well-being of children is a worthwhile investment. And that there's still a lot that we don't know. So we all have a lot of work still ahead of us. One thing, though, I will say that was in the paper that I don't think you got a chance to go to right now is the role of intra-household disparities to overall inequality. And it's one of the things that we've struggled with as well in just trying to come up with measures of income and inequality, trying to parse out and not make any assumptions about how inequalities within the household, primarily when we think of it, it's usually in terms of gender or age for older persons, can play out. And I don't know if you wanted to say a little bit about that. We're also interested in taking questions from the floor. So if participants have any questions that they'd like to ask, we still have you for another about 15 minutes, hopefully. So please put those questions in the Q&A and we can take them as they come. One question we did have too, just within the team, is about the distinction between predistribution and redistribution in terms of the policy debate on addressing inequality. And so, we do have this broad agreement now that investments in children and early childhood and even infancy and in utero is really important in terms of long-term impacts and inequality. But, is this distinction in talking about predistribution versus redistribution useful in moving the policy discussion forward? Because you have to fund those predistributive policies some way. And arguably the best way to do that is through redistribution, like progressive taxation. And by making this relationship clear in terms of how, I was wondering, by making this relationship clear, how redistribution contributes to predistribution, is that possibly a way where we could build more consensus on the importance of redistribution and particularly of progressive taxation?
Okay. Those are excellent points and questions, Maren. Let me take three things quickly on what you said. First, you talked about the uncertainty about levels and trends. And, in the case of Latin America, which is the one that we studied in that other paper, the paper with Nora and Francois and Facundo, we actually argue that in terms of trends, there's quite a bit of agreement. So the levels we're not so sure of, but there is this remarkable common trend of an inverted U curve, almost like a Kuznets curve, except I don't think it has anything to do with those mechanisms. From the 70s to say the mid 90s and 2000s, inequality was rising, and then there was a pronounced decline from the early 2000s or late 90s to the 2010, 15, and so on. And we speculate a little bit about what might have been behind each of these. But the point is whether although there were gaps of, as I mentioned, up to 15 points of the Gini in terms of the estimates, the general direction was very similar. Not always. You're right that in some cases, adding national accounts and tax data changes it, but they were the minority of cases. I cannot make that statement in general because I haven't looked at it, but in Latin America, at least, there is some sort of, reassurance about the trends. And in some sense, the trends matter more than the levels, right? I mean, they're high, these their levels. Whether the Gini is 50 or 65, it's outrageously high. And of course, it'll be better when I'm sure we'll get to the point where there'll be less uncertainty. But in the meantime, I think, we have to just live mentally with these bands. That was one point. Your point on intra-household inequality is very important. I think it differs for an organization like the UN, which is global in scope. I think the degree of that inequality differs across regions and countries, and I think there's still too little work on it, and it's an area which is quite important. Obviously, again, data availability there is really important because most of the estimates are based on models, right? Which try to model the bargaining power of people in the household, because consumption is typically measured at the household level, not the individual level. And that's what you would like to have. In some cases, there are surveys that do that, and those are extremely useful. So to the extent that you can encourage more collection of data on consumption at the individual level, that would be great. On predistribution and redistribution, I agree you need to finance those things. And so I think there's more agreement now as part of what I was saying in terms of raising those revenues in a progressive way. Whereas, when we started working on inequality in Latin America, when I started working on inequality in Latin America 30 years ago, the presumption at places like the World Bank was tax, don't do your redistribution through taxes. Tax with an emphasis on efficiency. And then if you want to redistribute, you redistribute on the expenditures. There's no reason why that should be the case. And I think there's less of a view like that now, and more of a view that progressive taxation is acceptable and often makes sense. The last point I'll make on that one is that I often think the distinction people make between pre-distribution and redistribution. I mean, both you have to raise taxes for. The difference is that in pre-distribution, you are effectively giving an in-kind transfer, a service of some sort to children, whereas redistribution is cash to adults. And people, middle class and richer people in particular, find it a lot easier to say, oh, I'm giving a service to a kid than, oh, I'm giving cash to these people who maybe, don't deserve it. The point, though, is that if the family is such an important transmitter of well-being, by giving greater resources to families, you're also helping in the future. This is why the welfare states of Scandinavia and Northern Europe do so well in that diagram.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, and that was exactly one of the points I had as well, is that it's giving a lot of times cash to parents that can then invest in their children's future. We have Pedro Conceição from the UNDP Human Development Report Office joining us, who would like to take the floor for a question. Pedro, please go ahead.
Thank you, Maren, and thank you, Marta and the team for organizing this seminar, and Chico, great presentation. I have a comment and a question for Chico. So the comment is that I very much agree that the frontier is where Chico landed. I think that's where we need to do more, and I would encourage the DESA team to take us forward with a report or with their work on the questions that Chico posed at the very end. And my question, Chico, is whether you've looked into the role of beliefs about inequality. So you spoke about the dissonance between public perceptions of the evolution of inequality and what the data says. And I was wondering if it's not important to understand the extent to which beliefs about the origins of inequality and whether it's fair or unfair mediate the kind of attitudes that people have towards not only policies, but also tolerating the Great Gatsby curve that you showed, or its equivalent. So what are the social mechanisms that sustain this, and whether beliefs play a role in this dynamic? Thank you.
Thanks, Pedro, and good to hear you again. We saw each other recently in Delhi, so it's nice to hear you online now. No, that's a very good question. I haven't personally worked on beliefs, although there's a lot of work out there, as you know. There's work, for example, that documents that people typically are not aware of the level of inequality in their countries as it's measured, that people often guess the direction of change wrong. But most importantly, on what you were talking about is, this dichotomy between, and a number of surveys, the world value surveys, the life in transition surveys that the BRD used to be involved in. A lot of these surveys, as you know, ask questions about why do people think they're poor people in their societies? And is it primarily their fault because they didn't work hard? Or is it primarily the fault of the fact that they didn't have connections or luck? So one view is more that your status in society is your responsibility, and it's due to what you did, to your efforts, or more a question of circumstances and where you started from. Those views are incredibly correlated with the left-right spectrum. People who identify themselves as right-wing tend to believe that where they are in society reflects their own work, whereas in others find it different. So I think working on information, just the facts on mobility and immobility and inequality of opportunity, may be important in that political sense as well, by actually saying, just without any judgment, this is how likely it is that people who are born in this decile move up to this other decile historically in the data. So that is, I think, important information that we can put out there.
Thank you, Chico. If you have time, I think maybe 5 more minutes. We've got a couple more questions from the floor. There are 3 kind of different questions. I mean, related to Pedro's question about beliefs, there is a question about what possibly could be the role of advocacy groups in shaping and influencing these perceptions on inequality. And if there's a role in maybe what you're saying now in terms of actually just presenting the data on the likelihood of mobility in trying to shape these perceptions around inequality. The second question I like because it links to the last webinar we just did with Darren Asamoglu. So the question is, what do you think will be the impact of AI on inequality if you had to make a prediction? And the third question we have then is regarding unionization. So it says, labor income is obviously a central factor in creating inequality, both in developing and developed countries. Seeing your last slide, it appears that the American dream is easier reached in many European countries, particularly Scandinavian countries. Have you studied what impact unionization has on income inequality?
Those are great questions. Let me take your first one was about advocacy groups, right? So let me take that one and the unionization one together first, because they are in some way related. I think the advocacy groups, obviously there's a huge variety of them, but I think they can play a real role. I mean, if you define advocacy broadly, there are, for example, certain NGOs and advocacy groups in the US that work primarily on legal injustices against poor people, and in particular Black people in the South. I'm thinking, for example, of the Southern Poverty Law Center and other groups like that. I think they are able to try and re-equilibrate a set of scales that are heavily tipped unjustly against these people. Right? The system is heavily unequal because of the laws themselves, but also how how you pay for lawyers and all kinds of reasons historically to do originally at the origin of it all with slavery. But these systems are heavily tilted against these people, and groups like that can try to even that out a little bit. So I think that's hugely important. More broadly, just advocacy around even the notions of inequality. I was recently working with some colleagues at Oxfam in trying to persuade the World Bank, where I used to work before, to incorporate a measure of inequality in their corporate scorecard. Now, when I was at the World Bank, I paid no attention to the corporate scorecard, but apparently people do pay attention to it. And so getting that number in there, may be useful, and we did through the support of the board. But it was Oxfam that pushed it really. So that's on advocacy. On unionization, I have never studied it myself, except I did on a paper that was about something else, about poverty dynamics in Brazil. We did find a positive impact of unionization. But just to say, other people have studied it, and particularly in the US, the finding is that unionization is heavily related to protecting the incomes of poorer workers in particular. So unionization, the balance of the evidence is that where there is more unionization over time and across industries, there is less wage disparity and a better floor. So unionization does play that role. And then on AI, I mean, Daron is a lot better than me to answer that question. I have very little to say. I mean, in developed countries, and I'm just going to say these two very brief things. In developed countries, AI is likely to continue doing what David Alter and others have documented for digitization and mechanization, which is to hollow the distribution, right? To sort of empty out the middle and push people to the top and to the bottom in some way. In developing countries, that's much harder question, because the structure of our productive economy is very different. So the effect of AI on poorer countries, I think, is really a research question that I have no idea of how to predict.
Great, thank you so much. I think we may be out of time, but I wanted to give you a chance if you had any kind of closing thoughts or final remarks you wanted to make to the group before we say goodbye.
No, just to thank you, Maren, again, you and Marta. Thank Pedro for being here and everybody else, and wish you the best of luck with the report. I look forward to seeing it when it comes out.
Thank you so much, Chico, and thank you to everybody who's been able to join us today. If you're interested, a recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel after the fact. So thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks so much, Chico. Thanks so much, Maren. Thank you.